Chào mừng các bạn quay trở lại với Đi Một Ngày Channel. Hôm nay chúng ta lại tiếp tục với đề tài chiến tranh Việt Nam nhé. Chúng ta sẽ cùng khái quát chiến tranh Việt Nam trong vòng 10 phút. Khi nắm rõ những thông tin này sẽ vô cùng thuận lợi cho các bạn khi thuyết minh trên xe. Để cho khách nắm rõ tình hình của chiến tranh Việt Nam và khách sẽ dễ dàng hiểu và tận hưởng chuyến tham quan hơn nhé. Và hôm nay chúng ta sẽ thuyết minh bằng tiếng Anh cùng với một người bạn của tôi. Nào chúng ta cùng bắt đầu John nhé.
Hello everyone, I'm John. Today I'm going to summarize the Vietnam War in 10 minutes. Hoping it will be helpful for your job. Now here we go. The Vietnam War has roots in Vietnam's centuries of domination by imperial and colonial powers, first China, which ruled ancient Vietnam, and then France, which took control of Vietnam in the late 1800s and established French Indochina. A grouping of the three Vietnamese regions of Tonkin, North Vietnam, Annam, Center, and Cochinchina, South Vietnam, with Cambodia was formed in 1887. Laos came under French control in 1893 and became part of Indochina in 1899. In 1939 the Second World War broke out. After 1940, when France was occupied by Nazi Germany, Vichy government had to accept the presence of Japanese troops in Vietnam. During this period, the communist leader Ho Chi Minh founded the Viet Minh, a nationalist liberation movement inspired by communist ideals, whose aim was to free Vietnam from foreign rule. March 1945, Japanese troops carry out a coup against French authorities, and announce an end to the colonial era. Until August 6 and 9, 1945, U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A few days later, Japan announced its surrender to the Allied forces. September 2, 1945, the Viet Minh took direct control from the French, and Ho Chi Minh declared the Democratic Republic of Vietnam independent. However, France had no intention for giving up the power in Vietnam. They refused to recognize Ho Chi Minh's declaration, and began to reassert its authority over Vietnam. Then driving Ho Chi Minh's communist forces into northern Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh appealed for aid from the United States, but because the United States was embroiled in the escalating Cold War with the Soviet Union, it distrusted Ho Chi Minh's communist leanings and aided the French instead. Fighting between Viet Minh and the French continued in this First Indochina War. Until 1954, Viet Minh launched a major siege against French bases in Dien Bien Phu. After 56 days was surrounded, French was defeated and surrendered to Viet Minh. And in July 1954, the Geneva Accord was signed, paving the way for the French to leave Vietnam. According to the Geneva Accords, Vietnam was divided into two parts: North Vietnam, under Ho Chi Minh and his communist forces, and South Vietnam, under a French-backed Emperor Bao Dai. The dividing line was set at the 17th parallel, and was surrounded by a demilitarized zone, or DMZ. The Geneva Accords stipulated that the divide was temporary, and Vietnam was to be reunified under free election to be held in 1956. At this point, the United States Cold War foreign policy began to play a major part in Vietnam. U.S. policy at the time was dominated by the domino theory, which believed that the fall of North Vietnam to communism might trigger all of Southeast Asia to fall, setting off a sort of communist chain reaction. Within a year of the Geneva Accords, the United States therefore began to offer support to the anti-communist politician Nhu Dinh Diem. With U.S. assistance, Diem took control of the South Vietnamese government in 1955, declared the Republic of Vietnam, and the nationwide election that had been scheduled for 1956 would never have been held. Diem's regime proved corrupt, oppressive, and extremely unpopular. Nonetheless, the United States continued to prop it up, fearful of the increasing communist resistance activity it noted in South Vietnam. This resistance against Diem's regime was organized by the Ho Chi Minh-backed National Liberation Front, which became more commonly known as the Viet Cong. In 1962, U.S. President John F. Kennedy sent American military advisors to Vietnam to help train the South Vietnamese army, but quickly realized that the Diem's regime was unsalvageable. Therefore, in 1963, the United States backed a coup that overthrew Diem and installed a new leader. However, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas less than a month after the coup. Lyndon B. Johnson became the new U.S. president, and things changed. Lyndon B. Johnson pledged to honor Kennedy's commitments but hoped to keep U.S. involvement in Vietnam to a minimum. After North Vietnamese forces allegedly attacked U.S. Navy ships in the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964, Lyndon B. Johnson ordered an airstrike and get Congress to push through the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which allowed him to escalate the United States' involvement in Vietnam without an actual declaration of war. Johnson was given carte blanche in the form of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, and began to send U.S. troops to Vietnam. Bombing campaigns such as 1965's Operation Rolling Thunder ensued, and the conflict escalated. Johnson's Americanization of the war led to a presence of nearly 400,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam by the end of 1966. As the United States became increasingly mired in Vietnam, it pursued a strategy of attrition, attempting to bury the Vietnamese Communist forces under an avalanche of casualties. However, the Viet Cong's guerrilla tactics frustrated and demoralized U.S. troops, while its dispersed, largely rural presence left American bomber planes with few targets. The United States therefore used unconventional weapons, such as napalm and the herbicide defoliant Agent Orange, but still managed to make little headway. In 1968, the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong launched a massive campaign, called the Tet Offensive, attacking nearly 30 U.S. targets and dozens of other cities in South Vietnam at once. Although the United States pushed back the offensive and won a tactical victory, American media coverage characterized the conflict as a defeat, and U.S. public support for the war plummeted. Morale among U.S. troops also hit an all-time low, manifesting itself tragically in the 1968 My Lai massacre, in which frustrated U.S. soldiers killed hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians in a small village. The story didn't emerge to the public until November 1969. Peace talks between U.S. and North Vietnam began in Paris in May 1968, which resulted in the stopping of bombing on North Vietnam. After a presidential campaign with many twists and turns, Richard Nixon was elected President of the United States. When Nixon came into office, the war was very unpopular and looking more and more unwinnable. Nixon began to withdraw troops from Vietnam in 1969 with a view of replacing them with South Vietnam forces. December 1972, President Nixon orders the launch of the most intense air offense of the war in Operation Linebacker, to pressure the North Vietnamese into a settlement on Paris Accords. The attacks, concentrated between Hanoi and Haiphong, dropped roughly 20,000 tons of bombs over densely populated regions. This ceasefire was finally signed in January 1973, and the last U.S. military personnel left Vietnam in March 1973. The U.S. government continued to fund the South Vietnamese Army, but this funding quickly dwindled. Meanwhile, as President Nixon became embroiled in the Watergate scandal that led to his resignation in August 1974, North Vietnamese forces stepped up their attacks on the South, and finally launched an all-out offensive in the spring of 1975. On April 30, 1975, the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon fell to the North Vietnamese, who reunited the country under communist rule as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, ending the Vietnam War. In 1976, North and South was unified into the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, and Saigon was renamed to Ho Chi Minh City.
Cảm ơn những thông tin bổ ích của John. Hy vọng các bạn có một bài thuyết minh dành riêng cho mình. Và đừng quên bấm đăng ký kênh để theo dõi những video mới nhất nhé. Chúc các bạn thành công!